Tell me about this monster. Sure, if you want to see him. The results are in. And it's him. The body was placed under a dead end sign.
New decomposed body of an unidentified African-American woman.
I mean, it's fascinating to me.
The sense of urgency came from catching him before he killed again.
When a monster comes to mind.
Unless they have a pair of scissors or a knife, it's over.
The victim had been decapitated.
Arm, elbow, hand, head.
Welcome back. Or if you are new, welcome. Haven't said that in a while. I haven't put my 2 seconds. Alright, we're sorted now. In today's video, I'm going to be telling you about the Baton Rouge killer. Or killers, should I say, but we're gonna look into the worst of the two. I will tell you about the other one, but the main guy here, Let's get into the story about the Baton Rouge killer. Okay, so there were 2 serial killers in the Baton Rouge area in Louisiana. That's where Baton Rouge is. And between the 2 of them, they are known to have raped and murdered at least 15 women between the years of 1992 and 2004. First of all, we have Sean Vincent Gillis, who was guilty of murdering and mutilating at least 8 women. And then there's a man called Derek Todd Lee, who was guilty of murdering at least 7 women. His victims were found either beaten, stabbed, or strangled to death. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about Derek, who was known by the police because he'd been arrested for stalking and voyeurism in the past. And the police didn't know that they were looking for 2 serial killers at this point, because everything was happening at the same time in the same area. The murders that were happening were kind of done in the same way, like beaten, strangled, stabbed, everything like that. So they thought they were just looking for one person here. But in January 2002, the FBI investigated one of the victims, and they found some of Derek's DNA under the fingernails of a woman called Geraldine Barr DeSotto. And following this discovery, on May 27th, 2003, Derek was arrested. And now at this point, the police assumed that the case was done and dusted. Like, they've caught the guy responsible. They've found the Baton Rouge killer. And because of his crimes, on October 14th, 2004, Derek was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But he didn't quite make it to his execution date, because on January 21st, 2016, at the age of 48, he died in hospital of heart disease. Now you might be thinking, 48 is pretty young. And it is a young age to die of something especially like heart disease. But he lived pretty much double the age of his victims. A lot of his victims, if not all, were in their 20s. So now let's move on to Sean Vincent Gillis, who is the main person in this story. He was born on the 24th of June 1962 in Baton Rouge. His upbringing wasn't smooth, and even though he was his mother's pride and joy, the main source of her happiness, he didn't know his father. So he had one parent giving everything to him, and then one parent that couldn't really care less. His father, Norman, deserted Sean when he was only a young boy, leaving Sean to be raised by his mother and his grandparents. But that's not exactly a bad thing, because Norman would drink a lot, which would result in him being quite aggressive and get pretty violent with Sean and his mother. And he actually almost killed Sean when he was a toddler. Like, Sean's mother, who's called Yvonne, by the way, once came home and saw Norman holding a gun up to Sean's head and threatening to kill the both of them. Yvonne ended up being able to get Sean away from Norman and ended up calling the police, which resulted in Norman being taken to a psychiatric hospital. So yeah, not a very good upbringing on the father side of things, but he did have a mother that adored every cell that made up his human. He was everything to her. She often called him her little blue-eyed angel, bragging that he was this really well-behaved, smart little boy. But the problem was, she would see her little angel as only that. He could do no wrong. She didn't see how things could maybe be a bit strange. When he was a little boy, he had quite the fascination with funeral homes. So much so that him and one of his cousins snuck into a funeral home and played around in the coffins. Now don't get me wrong, he did do normal things growing up, like he went to the mall, he went to the movies, hung out with his two best friends, John Green and John Rosis. But whilst they looked like they were living a normal life, to the outside world, they looked normal, they had interests that they didn't really want anybody else to know about. For example, they all took an interest in devil worship, often sneaking off to watch Satanists perform their rituals. It's now 1980 and Sean is 17 years old, and Sean's dad, Norman, re-entered his life, but very briefly. And I say briefly because it wasn't long before Sean discovered his dad's gay porn collection and described it as disgusting. So that was the last Sean saw of his father. He was disgusted by what he saw, so he left. He didn't talk to him anymore. Still at the age of 17, Sean was arrested for a DUI, traffic citations, and possession of marijuana. Fast forwarding a little bit to when Sean graduated from high school, and let's just say he didn't have a lot of ambition. He didn't want a job. The idea of doing anything like that, he did not take an interest in. And this only got worse after he discovered his fascination with adult entertainment. He became obsessed. But even more with the content on those sites that involved forced situations and dismemberment. It's now 1992 and Yvonne, his mother, decides that she wants to move to Georgia because she's got a new job. And obviously because Sean is her pride and joy, she wants him to move with her, but he says no, he wants to stay in Baton Rouge. So she tells him that she will continue to pay for the mortgage and the bills so that he can still live in that house. Bearing in mind, at this point, he was 30 years old and he was more than capable of going out and getting a job to support himself. But he didn't want to. He wanted his mother to pay his bills. Bills for a house that she is no longer living in. She's completely moved away, but she's still paying for a mortgage and all the bills just so that her son doesn't have to move with her. Now, obviously, with his parents not home, having a house to himself, no responsibilities, he had all the time in the world to feed his fascination with adult entertainment. He also dove deeper into his fascination with the darker things and would often do very random things that did not go unnoticed by his neighbours. They said that they would hear him howling in the middle of the night sometimes. And he was also known around there as a peeping Tom, and the women were a little uncomfortable by his presence because, he's a peeping Tom, and they called him this because he was once caught looking into the bedroom of a woman, just randomly, he didn't know her, he was just looking through her bedroom window. In 1994, Terry was introduced to a woman called Terry Lee Moyne by a mutual friend. And they apparently clicked instantly, got on from day dot. They bonded over things like Star Trek and collecting little items, and she thought he was just this really nice, sweet guy, the guy you'd want to take home and meet your parents, describing him as this really considerate and loving boyfriend, and often referred to him as a teddy bear. Now, Terry had been married before and divorced, obviously, because she's now with Sean. So making compromises in a relationship wasn't a new thing for her. Obviously they had their differences, but she wanted to make this work. So she would pretty much ignore all of them, and this happened throughout their entire relationship. They were together for 9 years. Imagine just brushing everything under the carpet for 9 years, just because you want to make something work. One thing that she just couldn't ignore was his infatuation with adult entertainment. Apparently he'd be on his computer watching that type of stuff all night. He would leave her to go to bed on her own and wake up on her own. He was literally there all night on his computer. And unlike Sean, Terry actually had a job. because, you know, she didn't have her mother paying for everything. But she did actually manage to convince him to get a job where she worked. But that only lasted like 3 weeks because he couldn't feed his addiction while he was working. To be fair, that wouldn't be the most bizarre thing that this man has done, but yeah, he ended up quitting after 3 weeks to return to his home to sit back in front of his computer and do his thing. It's now 3 a.m. on the 20th of March 1994 and Sean has found his first victim. He brutally murdered an 81-year-old woman called Anne Bryan who was living in an assisted living facility. And the only reason he was able to gain access into her room is because she left the door unlocked for the nurse to be able to come in and see her in the morning. But instead, Sean was the one that entered the room. He attempted to intimately violate her, but she screamed, and in an attempt to make her stop screaming, he cut her throat and then went on to stab her approximately 50 times all over her body. It was apparently so bad that he disemboweled her and nearly decapitated her. The next morning, as planned, the nurse came into the room and discovered the horrendous scene, but there was hardly anything anyone could do about it because there were no witnesses. Nobody saw what happened, leaving the police with no suspects and the community beyond scared. And it wasn't long after this that Sean and Terry moved in together. And it seems like he put the killing to one side for a bit because his next victim was apparently not for another 5 years. That's the next one to be documented anyway, but given the type of man that he was, it does not mean that murders didn't happen, that people just didn't connect to him. But we're not sure, that's just speculation, but it's not too far-fetched. It's now January 4th, 1999, and Sean has found his next victim, a 29-year-old woman called Catherine Ann Hall. She was a sex worker and got into Sean's car that night willingly for business purposes. Whilst they were in the car together, Sean tried to strangle her with something that he liked to call the objectifier, which was just like a zip tie, which was about 2 feet long. When talking about why he called it the objectifier, he said, "I called it that because it turned the women into the object that I would then deal with." He then stabbed her 16 times. Once he'd confirmed to himself that she was dead, he then intimately violated and mutilated her body. He wanted to clean up the car because evidence, so he went over to the Splash car wash and cleaned the car, sprayed it down. Catherine's body was still in the car at this point. That was until he decided to take her body out of the car and lay her on the ground, where he was cleaning the car. It was late at night, so nobody saw him do this, annoyingly. I don't know why he decided to take her body out of the car there and then, because that's not where he left the body. He ended up dumping her body on a rural road under a dead end sign, where she was later discovered by a hunter. Now, just a quick little note about Terry, which will come into play a little bit later on, but it was said that at this time she started having seizures, so it meant she couldn't drive, meaning that Sean then had to drive her to and from work. And also, she worked just across the street from where Sean's first victim was killed, the 81-year-old woman. Now, let's hop forward 4 months, where Sean has found his next victim, a woman that went by the name of Hardy Schmidt, who was 52 years old at the time. Sean began stalking her while she was on her morning jogs, which lasted around 3 weeks. So he spent 3 weeks stalking this woman in the morning. And then at 6:30 a.m. on May 30th, 1999, he hit her with his car and pushed her into a ditch with his car. And then he did not hesitate to leave his car and go over and strangle her. But he didn't want to kill her at this point. He didn't want to kill her like that. No, he was a lot more sick than that. He dragged her into his car and drove her to a nearby park, and then went on to intimately violate her and then kill her afterwards. And then after that, he dragged her to the trunk of his car. It's now the next day, and Sean is picking up Terry from work. They're driving along when Terry says that the car wasn't smelling good. There was a bit of a funky odour coming from the car. And he played it off that he'd just recently hit an animal and saying he'd washed down the car when he had a chance. On June 1st, Hardy Schmidt's body was found by a cyclist near the highway. They originally thought the suspect was her husband, but DNA found inside her body pointed them in a different direction. not much time passes and Sean's back at it again. He's found his next victim, a 36-year-old woman called Joyce Williams. The date is November 12th, 1999, and Sean picks her up and takes her to a sugarcane field near Port Allen, where he ended up strangling her with the zip tie, the objectifier. He didn't dispose of the body straight away. He actually ended up taking it home with him and pretty much performing an autopsy in his kitchen. He also intimately violated the body after she was dead and even ate some of it. He then moved on to cutting off both of her legs and decapitating her before putting the body parts into a bag and dragging them out to the car. It wasn't until the 22nd of January 2000 that Joyce Williams' remains were found. And in that same month, Sean killed another woman with a zip tie. This was 52-year-old Lillian Robinson, who was also a sex worker. Again, he took her body back to his house, but this time he didn't have a lot of time before Terry would be finishing work, so he didn't do as much to her body as he did his previous victim. A month later, her body was found by a fisherman near Whiskey Bay. But what's odd here is that the autopsy showed that she died by drowning after being thrown off a bridge. So was she still alive during everything? And then it was only after he threw her off a bridge that she died. It's now October 2000 and Sean's next victim was a woman called Marilyn Nevels. Unlike the others, she somehow managed to escape him, just like for a moment, but it wasn't long before he was able to get her back in his grasp and began beating her to death with a steel rod, and then dumped her body in a river near Baton Rouge. And it wasn't until Halloween that her body was found. It was around this time that murders were happening that Sean wasn't responsible for, and he was not happy because he saw this as competition. And he began taking notes about these other murders on his computer, and so did the police. In 2002, they formed a task force that focused on finding the killer. DNA was found on the body of Trinisha Colum, and this DNA linked her to another group of victims. And in May 2003, Derek Toddley was arrested. Now, everyone thought this was the Baton Rouge killer. Like I said before, they thought they've got the guy responsible. But, as we know, he was only one of them. This was another fascination added to Sean's resume. He got so into it that he collected newspaper articles and all the information he could find, along with pictures of Derek and his victims. He even had a file on his computer labelled DTL, which stood for Derek Toddley. And in Sean's life, at this point in time, Terry thought that he might be being unfaithful, because she noticed a lot of miles on the car for someone who was unemployed, didn't do anything outside of the house other than take her to and from work. So why were the miles going up if he seemingly did nothing with his time? So her first thought was, well, he's cheating on me. It's October 2003 and Sean's next victim is in sight. But this time, it's a little different. It's not like the others where they were complete strangers. This one was actually a friend of Sean's. They'd known each other for about 10 years. This was a 45-year-old woman called Johnny Mae Williams, who was also a sex worker. On the night of the murder, he drove her to a secluded area where he proceeded to beat her and intimately violate her before stabbing and strangling her to death. He also decided to take photos of her body after posing her in different ways before dumping her body in a field that was located behind a restaurant. When examining her body, they found that her legs had been cut open on both the front and the back, and that both of her hands were missing. But they also discovered something that brought them a little bit closer to finding the killer. A hair was found in her bone that narrowed their search to a white male. We're now looking at Sean's final victim, a 43-year-old woman called Donna Bennett Johnson, who was also a sex worker. There's a theme. I don't know why he targeted them, but there's a theme nonetheless. On the night of her murder, February 6th, 2004, she was actually drunk when Sean picked her up, but this obviously didn't stop him from doing what he wanted to do. He drove not too far from his home and then proceeded to strangle her to death. He cut up her body, and it's reported that he apparently ate some of her and then actually took one of her arms home to use for and I quote, extremely nefarious purposes. Her body was found the next day on the 7th of February in a drainage canal. It was this murder where he seemingly became a little bit sloppy with his cover-up. I don't know if he meant to, but the cover-up was not as it was before. Like with the others, it's like he knew how to clean it up. He knew how to cover the scene and get away with it to some extent. Like he had his way of getting around with actual dead bodies in the boot of his car. But with this one, whether he knew it or not, he left fresh tyre marks at the scene, which gave the police a new lead. They can do a lot with tyre marks. They contacted the Goodyear Tyre Company and asked them what kind of vehicle would use tyres like that. And they told the police it would be a white Chevrolet Cavalier. And to narrow it down even more, apparently only 90 people in the area bought tyres like that. Major Brian White, who was working on the case, told the police officers to locate every person in the area that had bought those tyres and interview them, and also take some DNA in the process. They needed the DNA, obviously, because that helps them even more, but also they wanted to find DNA that matched the DNA that they'd found on the bodies of Catherine Hall, Joni Mae Williams, and Donna Johnson. They needed the DNA from the people they were interviewing because the DNA that they found on the bodies didn't match anybody in their systems. Now, going back to the list of people that had purchased those tyres, Sean was listed at number 26. They weren't looking at him as a suspect because he didn't have like a criminal record or anything, so they weren't suspicious. That was until he started making some very weird statements. He admitted off the bat that Joni Mae Williams was his friend and that she had been in his car. Now that isn't too weird because, you know, friends of 10 years are gonna hang out and that could occasionally be in a car. But he didn't stop there. He added to his story that he stopped at the crime scene location because he had to pee. So at this point the police had heard enough to suspect him just a little bit, so they asked him to go to the police station to have a little chat, and Sean happily did it. And when he was asked if they could record it, he was happy for them to do that too. Why? Obviously I'm not mad that he was happy for them to do that, but like, he's the guy they're looking for, and they're pulling him up on something that he is responsible for, and he's happy to go to the police station willy-nilly and for them to record the conversation. Okay, I'm not going to ask questions, okay. They questioned him about Joni, asking that if they were to look, would they find traces of her blood in his car? To which he responded, yes, and then went on to say that she had got her period in the front seat of his car and like bled onto the seats. He even said that it looked like a massacre. They also asked him if they would find blood in the back seat of the car, to which he also answered yes. And his reason why is just, oh god. He said that if there is traces of her blood on the back seat or in the back of the car, it's because of the wind. Like she got her period in the front of the car and the wind blew it to the back. After this, Major Brian White had heard enough. He left the room and asked for the cheek swab that they took of Sean because he was adamant, like he was convinced this was the guy they're looking for. He also requested a search warrant for both his home and his car. They needed to get as much evidence as they could on Sean because, like I've said in my previous videos, they can't hold people in custody for too long without actual evidence. But on April 29th, 2004, Sean is arrested at 1:30 in the morning. They did a night call. They showed up while the moon was shining. With all the evidence that they had found, they were able to arrest Sean and also inform a very confused and concerned Terry that she had in fact been living with a serial killer. When talking about that night, Terry said, "I laughed at the police when they told me why they arrested him. I literally laughed. And I told them, boy, do you have the wrong house." But when Terry asked Sean about it, he admitted it. Like, he wasn't trying to hide this. It's almost as if he was happy he was caught. But I don't know, I wasn't there. When searching the property, they found a hacksaw, knives, a machete, a wooden club, a 14-inch bayonet, and the zip ties. along with the weapons, they found photos of Joni Mae Williams and a number of computers and serial killer books, and then also the newspaper articles about Derek Lee and his murders. When looking into the computer, they found files about the Manson murders, Russian necrophilia, hangings, and beheadings. We're looking at the day that he was questioned, and it's currently 7 a.m, by which time he had already confessed to 8 murders, and when he went into detail about these murders, he was laughing. He found it funny. Like everything he did to them, he found it funny. But annoyingly, none of this stuff that he was saying could be used in court, because just before saying these things, he requested a lawyer and then spilled the beans. So they couldn't use this against him, because him requesting a lawyer meant that the tape was inadmissible. But don't worry, Major Brian White was not letting this little technicality get in the way of bringing this case to justice. Now, because the tape wasn't allowed to be used, they needed to present the court with hard evidence in order to prosecute Sean. And they had this, because during the search of his home, they found 45 digital photos of Donna Bennett Johnson, and some other photos were found of some of his other victims. In one of the photos, it shows a body in the trunk of the car and also his license plate. And along with that, if that wasn't enough already, they found that he actually kept pieces of his victims in his house. A woman called Tammy Pera, who was a lifelong friend of Joni, was the final piece of the puzzle. She turned letters over to the police from Sean. Now, she was the one that sent the first letter, but he replied to her and went into detail about what he did to Joni. Now, when it came to his sentencing, the prosecution was obviously rooting for the death sentence, but on the 21st of July 2008, Sean was given 3 life sentences. I held up 2, I meant 3, without the possibility of parole. Now, I think it's pretty fair to say that whilst there were 2 murderers, Sean was the more disturbed than the other. I'm not saying that Derek wasn't disturbed for what he was doing, but Sean went above and beyond to just do all he wanted to these women. Like, the most disturbing thing about him was the fact that it wasn't the murders that was the most disturbing, it was what he did to them after they were dead that made him worse than Derek. I don't really know where to start when it comes to talking about this, what we've just learned. Not 1, but 2 serial killers at the same time in the same area. I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to Baton Rouge. Just a little fact as well, apparently Louisiana rates 7th in the whole of the US for producing serial killers. I don't like that. I don't like that. Anyways, if you did enjoy this story time, if you want to see more from me ever, why don't you subscribe? Just hit the little subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss when I upload. And because I have definitely chatted your ear off in this video with all of those facts, I am going to love and leave you and wish you a very good day, night, evening, any time of day. I hope it's great for you. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video and love you, bye.